how's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Monday night. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? Yehud in South Carolina, Stephen in New Hampshire, Lucy in Minnesota, Bill in mid-Missouri, Bella in Florida, Paul in the great Northwest loves the music. Tom, happy Monday from PA. Shandora in the Bronx. Sharon in New Jersey. Ella's in the house. Rochelle wishing Chodesh Tov. We started the new month. It was Friday and Saturday, absolutely. And Marjorie, shalom from Georgia. We didn't just start a new month. We started Adar, right? So this is a leap year. And the way the Hebrew calendar works is we don't add a day, we add a month. And which month do we add? The month of joy, the month that contains Purim in it. So when we have a leap year, so we have Adar 1 and Adar 2. We're now in Adar 1. And when Adar comes in, our joy increases. It's a mitzvah, a commandment to increase our joy this month. And it may not come natural. It may not be easy. Some people are not naturally joyful, and that's okay. That's natural. But you have to train yourself. You have to train yourself to appreciate the things around you that we often take for granted, and that we can take joy in them, right? Somebody was saying if you put your face in a sink full of water for 30 seconds, lift it up, and you'll appreciate the air that you're breathing. So we really have to train ourselves to find what to be grateful about, find what to be, rejoicing and praising God for the many gifts and blessings that surround us. And this is the month to especially do that. And we always have that command in Adar, but in a leap year, we have 2 Adars. So not just 30 days of increased joy, but 60. And then Purim will be in 2nd Adar, in Adar 2. Okay, as promised, I owe you a story, the follow-up story from Motzi Shabbos, from Saturday night. And even though we're doing a double daf today, no problem. They're 2 short pages, and that's why we're going to do that now. And look at the number of pages that we have reached. Numbers 1499 and 1500. Today we're covering the 1500th page of the Talmud when one is making the journey from Tractate Brachas to Tractate, is it Nida? It's Nida, the final tractate. So in our 7.5-year journey that has 2,711 pages, today we're reaching the 1500th page, well past the halfway point. And that's a big deal. There's something to rejoice in right there. Okay, and so this idea, what I was talking about Saturday night, is what is a soul worth? What is a mitzvah worth? Right, these things that are impossible to assess their value. Well, particularly with respect to mitzvahs, right? So when we follow, when we observe, when we fulfill our obligations, and Jews have 613 obligations in the Torah, many of which we are unable to fulfill in the absence of the Holy Temple in Jerusalem, and many that we can fulfill. But even if you're not Jewish, you've got the 7 Noahide mitzvahs, and as we talked about many times, the Sheva mitzvahs b'nei Noach, the 7 Noahide commandments. They're not just simple commandments. They're broad categories that require a lot of learning. So everybody is performing a mitzvah by learning, right? And whenever we're doing Torah study, that is a beautiful, beautiful mitzvah that we're doing. And what is it worth? It's worth the value that you put in it, right? Your commitment to it, how important it is for you to perform that mitzvah, that has a tremendous bearing on how valuable it is considered before the heavenly court, as it were. So to help illustrate that point, Rabbi Luria shared with us this incredible story that took place, let's bring down our joy for just 1 second, in a concentration camp. So during World War II, Jews dying right and left, suffering, being abused as slaves. And in the midst of that horror, there were 2 Jews in one of the camps, and I apologize, I don't remember which camp it was, but they were being used as slaves. So there was a Jew named Akiva, and I mean, it was backbreaking, terrible, frigid, in the cold of Northern Europe type of labor. Starvation diet. I mean, working hard, tough manual labor all day, not eating enough, not sleeping enough. You get back to the barracks at the end of the day and you just collapse. Akiva, this fellow, gets back, and there's another fellow there named Aryeh, right? And Aryeh says to Akiva, let's learn something. Let's do some Torah learning. Akiva says, are you crazy? I'm exhausted. I can barely think straight. Now we're going to learn. Aryeh says, yes, let's learn. Akiva says, even if I wanted to learn, we have no books. What are we going to learn from? And Aryeh says, I have the entire Shas, right? The entire Talmud memorized. He knows it all by heart. That is the way people used to learn it. And he says, I have it all by heart, so we can do it, from my memory. And Aryeh was such a nudnik. He kept insisting. Akiva finally gave in, and they start learning together. And night after night, they're learning together from the pages that Aryeh has memorized. Now, I should say that this story is bracketed by the fact that Akiva survives, and 40 years later, he's living in Bnei Brak. So in the 80s, he's living in Bnei Brak, Israel, and he goes to his rabbi, very upset, very shaken, because he's had a dream that, he's trying to understand what to do with it. And when the rabbi says, what is it all about? And now Akiva is telling this story about what went down in the concentration camp with Aryeh during the war 40 years before. So Aryeh wins the argument. They start learning together. Night after night, they're learning different things. And now Passover is approaching. And Aryeh, the nudnik, says, we got to have some matzah so that we can fulfill our obligation on Pesach, on Passover. Akiva says, are you insane? Where are we going to get matzah? It's not like we're going to go to the market and buy some matzah. You got to figure out a way, Akiva. You got to figure out a way. You're the strong one. You're the tough one. You're the one who gets to go on those work details outside the camp. Find a way. Get us some matzah. Akiva's like, yeah, okay, sure. But the next day on the work detail, what are they doing? I think they're like sort of putting some tar down on a road that the Nazis need. And an Allied bomb, hits some kind of a storage place. And Akiva walks by, and there's actually a sack of flour that has been, like the explosion thrusted out. It's broken. The contents are spilled all over the ground. But he's able to take a handful of flour. He's able to find some water as well. He basically puts the flour and the water together and is able to bake it right into a flat bread on, I think, the machine that they were using to, melt the tar to put on the road. But somehow he was able to make, I can't say what it tasted like, but he was able to make some flat bread, some matzah that they could eat on Passover. Certainly no leavening in that bread. He hides it inside, his skimpy garment, and he's walking back into the concentration camp at the end of the day, and one of the guards sees him, kind of holding his arm in a funny way. What are you doing? What do you got there? Nothing. But pretty soon it comes out that he's got something in his clothes, and the guard starts beating poor Akiva on the head, on the body, on the back. He's bleeding. He's lucky to survive the beating. He passes out. When he wakes up, of course, the matzah's gone, but there's a few crumbs of it left near him. How much? A ketzayis, right? The minimum amount that you would have to eat on Passover to fulfill your obligation to eat matzah on the first night of Passover. This he brings back to the barracks. And Aryeh's like, no, were you able to get some matzah? Did you get some matzah? Akiva's like, yeah, I got some matzah. Tells the story getting beat up, and he's got this one piece. Aryeh says, okay, so let me have that piece. Akiva says, are you crazy? I was beaten within an inch of my life for this mitzvah. I'm going to do the mitzvah. Aryeh is so desperate to do the mitzvah, he keeps insisting, give it to me, give it to me. No, I'm not going to give it to you. Finally, Aryeh says, well, what about the Haggadah? Do you know how to recite the Haggadah on Passover night? No, I don't have a Haggadah. I know the Haggadah by heart like I know the Talmud. I'll recite the Haggadah with you. That's nice, you'll recite the Haggadah. I'm not giving up the matzah. Aryeh keeps insisting. Finally, Aryeh says, I'll tell you what. Let me eat the matzah, but you will have the reward. I don't get any reward in heaven for eating that matzah. I hereby grant you the zechus, the merit for eating the matzah. I just want to have the ability to eat the matzah, but you get the merit for it. This guy's not going to leave him alone. Akiva says, fine, you eat the matzah, I'll take the merit. Aryeh is so happy that he's going to be able to eat matzah on Passover in such conditions that it's like he's overflowing with joy the rest of the week. Passover comes, and before we go to our Seders, Passover night, we go to shul, we go to synagogue, and we recite Hallel that night. And Aryeh in the barracks, so excited, starts to recite the blessing on the Hallel, and gets so carried away with it that he's shouting it. And a guard comes in, sees this Jew shouting, realizes he's doing something religious. No mercy. Shoots Aryeh and kills him. The Nazis were Nazis. Akiva manages to survive. He did eat the crumbs that Passover. After the war, he makes his way to Israel. He marries, he has children, and he raises a big family and celebrates many Passovers for 40 years. And then in the 80s, he has a dream. And Aryeh comes to him in the dream. And he says, listen, I'm in the world to come. I'm in a beautiful place in the world to come. I mean, all of us who died in the camps, it was a Kiddush Hashem. Of course, we're in the world to come. But I have no peace because I keep thinking about that one mitzvah that I was not able to do. You ate the matzah and you got the merit. Akiva, please give me the merit. Give me the reward for eating that matzah. And Akiva in the dream says, what are you kidding? I got beat up. It was like it was fresh as the day it happened. In Akiva's mind, he says, I'm not going to give you the reward for that. And he woke up, very upset. And he went to see his rabbi about this. What did his rabbi say? His rabbi said, listen, Akiva, for 40 years, you've enjoyed your family. You've fulfilled the mitzvah of eating matzah on Passover 40 times. Aryeh lost all of that, lost all the potential, all the family members he might have had after the war. He lost all of that. Give him the reward for that mitzvah. Akiva says, you're right. How do I do it? His rabbi says, go stand in front of the Aron, the ark where the Torahs are stored in the synagogue, and pour out your heart and say, you freely give the reward and the merit for eating that piece of matzah on Passover that you had in the camp. You give, which is an incredibly holy thing to do, right? To fulfill that mitzvah under such conditions and be beaten for it. Enormous reward. You give that reward to Aryeh. Akiva says, okay. He goes, he stands in front of the ark, in front of the Torahs. He cries out his heart and says, I freely give that reward to Aryeh. And that night he has a dream. And Aryeh comes to him and says, thank you. Thank you, my holy brother. I'm now completely at peace in the world of truth, in the world of souls. Thank you. Now, that's a documented story. You could say, dreams, what stock do we put in dreams? Or if you're a person of faith like me, it's like, wow. And that illustrates what it's worth. What a mitzvah is worth if you give your heart and commitment to it, right? And Rabbi Luria told us that story. If you learn every day, don't miss a day because something came up. If you pray every day, don't miss a day because something came up. Because your commitment to fulfill your obligations, that's what makes them special and beautiful and recognized in the upper chamber. Okay, that's the story I wanted to share with you. Let's get into our learning that we do every day, thank God. So we picked this up on 101A. We got a good head start on 101A yesterday. We've been talking about what happens when you give a wool to a dyer and he burns it, and we were comparing this to when you give wood to a craftsman, and you were told, and he makes a mistake and he destroys the box that he was building for you, or he builds the wrong item. So when a craftsman makes a mistake, let's continue this discussion. Ravina said, with what are we dealing here? Yesterday, at the end of yesterday, and this is what we're actually dealing with now, is this idea that if you, if somebody steals wool and dye, or if you give it to the dyer and he puts the wrong dye into the wool, and one of the questions that comes up in the analysis of this question is, once the dye enters the wool, the value of the wool is enhanced because dyed wool, it costs money to have it dyed. But does the dye still exist? Does the dye still have some kind of separate entity? Is it still some kind of separate entity that could be acquired? Or is it basically mevatel? Is it nullified in the wool because it has no substance now that the wool itself is colored? So Ravina said, with what are we dealing here? We're dealing with a case where there was wool that belonged to one person and dyes that belonged to a different person. And a monkey came. And a monkey came and dyed the wool with those dyes. Why a monkey? Because in other words, it wasn't one of them who did the dyeing. It was not a thief. It was not the owner of the wool. It was not the owner of the dye. It was not a craftsman. It was an outside entity that now, connected the dye with the wool. So a monkey came and dyed that wool with those dyes. So the dilemma is like this. Is the law that the enhancement which dye provides to the wool is substantive, so that the owner of the dye can say to the owner of the wool, give me my dyes that are with you? Or perhaps the enhancement which the dye provides to the wool is not substantive, and the owner of the wool can say to the owner of the dye, there is nothing of yours with me, and he is exempt from liability because the dyes no longer exist. So having determined the scenario in which the dilemma is relevant that we were discussing all of yesterday, so the Gemara proceeds to resolve the dilemma. Come in here, a solution from a Mishna, tractate orlah, a garment that one dyed with dye extracted from peels of orlah. So what's orlah? Orlah is fruit that you would take from a fruit tree during its first 3 years of growth. Prohibited for Jews to eat it or even to derive benefit from the fruit of a fruit tree during its first 3 years of growth. So a garment that one dyed with dye that was extracted from peels of orlah, right? The prohibited fruit, not only can you not eat it, you can't benefit from it. So fruit that grows on a tree during its first 3 years, and its peels must be burned. And if you make clothing that you dye out of those peels, then you have to burn the clothing because you cannot derive benefit from the dye. So apparently the enhancement of an item's appearance is considered a significant matter, and the dye therefore remains an independent substance even after having been absorbed by the wool. Makes sense. If the wool wasn't dyed, it would look different. It might be far less beautiful. So of course the dye adds something to the wool, but the Gemara rejects this resolution. Rava said the reason the garment must be burned is not because the dye remains an independent substance. Rather, it is because the Torah prohibited benefit that is visible to the eye, as it is taught in a baraisa, meaning from the orlah. As the verse states, Leviticus 19:23, and shall have planted all manner of trees for food, then you shall count the fruit thereof as forbidden. 3 years shall it be as forbidden to you, it shall not be eaten. And you see, the verse is quite repetitive about you can't use it, it is forbidden, it shall not be eaten. We would have known that right away if it just said once, for 3 years its fruit is forbidden, but now that it adds, it shall not be eaten, and that it shall be as a forbidden substance to you, must be teaching extra lessons. So from this verse, I have derived only a prohibition against eating it. From where is it derived that one may not derive benefit from it, and that one may not dye with dyes extracted from the fruit, and that one may not light a lamp with oil extracted from the fruit? And the Baraisa answers, the verse states, then you shall count the fruit thereof as forbidden. 3 years shall it be forbidden to you. It shall not be eaten. So these repetition is to include all these types of benefit in the prohibition. Consequently, there is an explicit derivation that an item dyed with orlah dye is forbidden, and we can't learn from it that dye remains a substantive item even after it has entered wool or other textile. So the Gemara attempts another resolution of our dilemma. Come in here a resolution from that which was taught in a Baraisa. A garment that one dyed with dye extracted from the peels of produce from the shmitta year, the sabbatical year, right? So during the sabbatical year, when this was practiced in Israel, and still is in a modified way, but in the ancient times when it was fully practiced, so for 6 years, the farmers would plant their fields and take in the crop and tithe it, etc. And in the 7th year, they would not plant and they would not harvest. They would leave the land completely fallow. Now, crops would grow wild there, and they were considered as ownerless fields, and you could go, and anybody could go and eat the food that was in the field, but you couldn't plant it, you couldn't harvest it, right? So now that if you have something, you couldn't harvest it as your own, right? So therefore, a garment that one dyed with dye that was extracted from the peels of produce from the sabbatical year, meaning prohibited harvested produce, even if it was being used for dyeing as opposed to eating, must be burned when the time for the elimination of sabbatical year produce arrives. And this indicates that the dye evidently remains an independent substance, but the Gemara rejects this proof. It is different there, as the verse states, shall all increase thereof be? And the phrase shall be teaches that it will always remain as it is, i.e. it retains its status as sabbatical year produce despite any change to its form. And the Gemara... And so the Gemara states that Rava, now we're on 101b, raises a contradiction. We learned in a Mishna in Tractate Orlah that a garment that one dyed with dye extracted from peels of orlah must be burned. So apparently the change in appearance precipitated by the orlah peels is considered a significant matter, and the dye retains its status as orlah. And raise a contradiction from a different Mishnah that with regard to a quarter lug of blood from a corpse that was absorbed in the floor of a house. So blood that comes from a living person, it might be gross. It's something that a lot of people, don't like the sight of blood, etc. But it is not tameh. It does not impart impurity. Blood from a corpse does impart tuma, right? So if, for example, you had teruma, that was the first part of the tithe that's given to a Kohen, and both the teruma and the Kohen must be in a state of ritual purity. They must be tahor for the Kohen, the priest, to be able to eat the teruma. If either he became tameh, ritually impure, or the teruma became tameh, then he can't eat it, right? So blood from a corpse would render either him or the teruma tameh, ritually impure, but blood from a person would not. Exception, of course, is menstrual blood does impart tuma, but blood from a cut in your arm does not, right? So now we're talking about what about blood from a corpse? So with regard to a quarter log, so a volume, that's the minimum volume that we need for this law to kick in. With regard to a quarter lug of blood from a corpse that was absorbed in the floor of a house, every vessel in the house is tameh by virtue of being under the same roof as the blood. Now this is corpse tuma. So if you have a corpse in a room, so then all the different types of utensils that are subject to tuma when touched, if they're in the same room with a human corpse, they become tameh. And a piece of a corpse will do the same thing, and this volume of blood will do the same thing from a corpse. And some say that any vessel in the house is tahor. It is not tameh. It's still ritually pure. And these two statements do not disagree, as this first statement was in reference to vessels that were in the house at the outset, before the blood was absorbed in the floor. And the second statement was in reference to vessels that came into the house at the end, after the blood had already been absorbed. Right? So why are we talking about this law? Because we're talking about the blood, the corpse blood being absorbed in the floor the way that dye could be absorbed into wool. So the Mishnah continues. If the blood was absorbed in a garment, it is examined. And if the garment is washed and a quarter lug of blood emerges from it, so then the garment is tameh. And the garment imparts tuma to the vessels in the house as well. But if not, if we're talking about less than a quarter lug of blood that emerges from the garment, then it is pure and it does not impart impurity, right? Because a quarter lug is not so small. It's a significant amount of blood from a corpse, right? So if we have less than that, this law doesn't apply. More than that, yes, it does. So apparently only the blood that can be removed from the garment is considered blood, right? Because it said not how much was spilled into the garment, and we may not know how much was spilled into it, but if you could wring it out and pull a quarter lug of blood out of the garment, then it would impart this tuma to all the vessels in the room. Now you see why they're bringing this law, because when we're talking about dye, you can't recover the dye from the wool, right? Because the wool has changed color. But if you can recover the blood from a garment, squeeze it out, then it will impart tuma. So apparently only the blood that can be removed from the garment is considered blood, while the blood absorbed in the garment is insignificant. If this is the case, then the change in appearance precipitated by the blood is not considered a significant matter, and the blood absorbed in the garment does not remain an independent substance, which is what we've been asking about the dye. Does the dye that changes the color of the wool remain an independent substance? So the Gemara presents an answer. Rav Kahana said, a law from among the leniencies applied to the measurements of a quarter lug was taught here, as the Mishnah is written in reference to the blood of submission that is discharged from a body at the time of death, and such blood is tameh, ritually impure by rabbinic law, but in general, a change in appearance precipitated by blood is considered significant. So this blood of submission, very interesting. The Tanaim of the Mishnah, Tractate Ocholot, disagree with regard to the precise definition of this blood of submission. According to Rabbi Kiva, it is the last 1/8 of a lug emitted before death from the body of a person who was killed, and the first 1/8 of a lug emitted after the death. Rabbi Yishmael defines the blood of submission in the same manner, but extends it to a quarter lug of blood emitted before and after the death. And other Tanaim offer different definitions, right? So you can see what the issue is there. It's beyond the scope of today's conversation, but the basic issue there is a person is dying and he's bleeding out. So that blood that comes out of him, could be a lot of blood. Is that blood from a corpse? Well, he was alive when that blood went out on the floor. We're not quite sure when he died. So which is the blood that was emitted by the corpse? And which was the blood that was emitted by a live person? That would be a halakhically significant question. Now, let's move on. Having cited a contradiction raised by Rava, the Gemara proceeds to cite another. Rava raises another contradiction. We learned in a Mishnah concerning plants from among the species that are used as dyes. For example, the sefichin, i.e. produce that grew without being intentionally planted, of woad and safflower, that they have sanctity of sabbatical year, and money exchanged for them has sanctity of the sabbatical year. So additionally, they are subject to the laws of eradication, and money changed for them is subject to the law of eradication. So what's eradication? Eradication. This is called biur. There are two primary opinions with regard to the requirement to eradicate produce of the sabbatical year. Moreover, among those who hold each opinion, there is disagreement with regard to the details. But basically, Rashi, Rambam, and the Ravad hold that eradication must be performed after a given type of produce is no longer found in the field, and it is performed by destroying any of that same species of produce that remains in one's house by burning it, throwing it into the sea, or the like. And this is basically the idea that, during the 7th year, all Israel was the same, right? Even rich people who had many fields, it's not like they could store up this huge amount of food in their houses that the poor would not have access to. So the idea is that all the fields are ownerless during the Shemitah year, and you can take whatever you want from those fields. We're not farming them. We didn't plant there, but wild produce will grow there anyway. And then when a particular type of produce ends in the field, then the people have big storage of it in the house actually have to remove it from the house. The Tosafot, the Smog, and the Ramban maintain that the process of eradication entails removing the produce from one's house and then declaring it ownerless. And when a given type of produce is no longer in the field, one removes it from his home and then declares it ownerless and renders it available to both the poor and the wealthy to eat in the field. At that point, anyone may consume it, including the owner, if he reacquires it. But you can't hoard all kinds of food. It has to be made available to everybody. So why are we talking about this? Because we're talking about, we're back to the subject of shmitta produce that could be used for dyes. Can we use it for dyes? Shmitta produce is prohibited for benefit, but really that's all about eating. What about dyeing? So apparently wood, which is a type of inedible growth, is subject to the sanctity of the sabbatical year, despite the fact that it is not edible. So that would indicate that dyes as well. And we raise a contradiction from a Baraisa with regard to reed leaves and vine leaves that one piled for storage upon the field. If he gathered them for eating, they are subject to the sanctity of the sabbatical year. But if he gathered them for use as wood, meaning for kindling a fire, then they are not subject to the sanctity of the sabbatical year. So apparently wood or any other non-food product is not subject to the sanctity of the sabbatical year. And Rava answers the contradiction as the verse states, and the Sabbath produce of the field shall be for food for you, Leviticus 25:6, indicating that the sanctity of the sabbatical year takes effect only with regard to those items whose benefit and whose consumption coincide, as is the case with regard to food. Wood is excluded as its benefit follows its consumption. The primary purpose of kindling wood is not accomplished with the burning of the wood, rather it is with the charcoal that heats the oven. Therefore, wood is not subject to the sanctity of the sabbatical year. The Gemara objects, but isn't there wood that is used to provide heat, whose benefit coincides with its consumption, as one enjoys the warmth provided by the fire while the wood is being burned? And Rava said, unspecified wood exists for fuel, i.e. charcoal, so its benefit follows its consumption. Now we're on 102a. Rav Kahana says, in the matter of whether kindling wood, whose benefit follows its consumption, right? You get the benefit at the time that it's being burned. Whether this is subject to the sanctity of the sabbatical year, this is a dispute among the Tanaim, as it is taught in the Tosefta, Tractate Shevi'it 625. One may not transfer sabbatical year produce, for example, wine, to another person, neither for soaking flax to prepare it for spinning, as the benefit derived from the flax follows its soaking when the soaked and spun thread is woven into a garment, nor for laundering with it, as the benefit derived follows the laundering when one wears the clean clothes. Soaking the flax or laundering the garment in wine is considered the consumption of the wine, as it is no longer potable. And so Rabbi Yosef says one may transfer to another sabbatical year produce for soaking and for laundering, right? So they're disagreeing. Is the benefit that you derive from soaking and laundering included within the prohibition of the sabbatical year, or is it more food? So the Gemara asks, what is the reasoning for the statement of the rabbis? The verse states with regard to the sabbatical year produce for food. It says that, Leviticus 25:6, from which it is inferred, but not for soaking, for food, but not for laundering. And Rabbi Yosef says that it is permitted, as the verse also states, for you, from which it is inferred, for you, for all your needs, even for soaking and for laundering, meaning that it would be prohibited. So the Gemara asks, and according to the rabbis as well, isn't it written for you? How do they explain that term? And the Gemara answers, from the term for you, it is derived for you, similar to for food, meaning the sanctity of the sabbatical year takes effect with regard to those items whose benefit and whose consumption coincide, which excludes soaking and laundering, where the item's benefit doesn't coincide, but rather follows. It's very interesting, right? So when you use wine, for example, hard to imagine, but okay. If you're going to use wine for laundering, so, as opposed to when you drink wine, okay, so it's used up at the same time that you're getting the benefit from it. If you use it for laundering, it's being used up. You're not going to be able to drink it after that. But the clothes aren't ready to wear immediately as they're being laundered, so you're not really getting the benefit from it, although you could say, well, just having clean clothes in my possession is a benefit to me. But maybe not. Maybe the benefit only comes later, and they're saying that the sages have deduced from the way it's put in the Torah that that sanctity of the Shemitah year only applies to when the consumption and the benefit coincide, not when they're sequential. Now the Gemara asks, and according to Rabbi Yosei as well, isn't it written for food? Rabbi Yosei could have said to you, that term is necessary for that which is taught in a Baraisa, as it is taught. The verse states for food, but not for a poultice, right? Sometimes you use, a product of the field, whether it's flowers or a grain or something like that, medicinally. Not to eat it medicinally, but to make a dressing for a wound. That's a poultice. So for food, but not for a poultice, right? So Rabbi Yossi is saying it's permitted to use it for a poultice. It's only prohibited to use it for food. And the Brisa continues, do you say for food, but not for a poultice? Or perhaps it is only for food, but not for laundering. So when the verse says, for you, laundering is already stated as permitted since it includes all of one's bodily needs. How do I realize the meaning of that which the verse states for food? It is for food, but not for a poultice. So the Gemara continues, should one ask, and what did you see that led you to include the use of sabbatical year produce for laundering and to exclude the use of sabbatical year produce as a poultice? Perhaps the opposite should be said. And the Baraisa answers, I include the use for laundering, which applies equally to every person, as everyone needs clean clothes. And I exclude the use of a poultice, which does not apply equally to every person, as it is only for the ill or the wounded. So in accordance with whose opinion is that which is taught in a Baraisa with regard to the sabbatical year produce, for food, but not for a poultice, for food, but not for sprinkling. Sprinkling, in this case, when we're talking about sprinkling wine, right, we've talked about sprinkling for, to purify somebody with the waters of purification, or sprinkling the blood of a sacrifice on the altar. Now we're talking about sprinkling in somebody's home. Most of these homes had dirt floors. And you could sprinkle a very pungent wine on the floor of the house to make the house smell good. You can imagine they didn't have quite the same, they didn't have ready access to showers and the kinds of, hygienic luxuries that we have in the modern world. So the ancient world was probably a pretty smelly world. And if you wanted to cover those odors, one of the ways to do that was you get a particular kind of wine that's very pungent and you sprinkle it in the house. So this is a different use of wine, right? Not for eating, but rather to make a nice smell. And there's a note here from Rav Steinsaltz that says rich people took this quite seriously, and the kinds of wines that were used for sprinkling were actually more expensive than the fine wines that were used for drinking. So now they're saying, well, perhaps wine used for sprinkling is permissible, using that wine from the Shemitah year for that, because it's not for eating. For food, but not for a poultice. For food, but not for sprinkling. For food, but not to make an emetic from it to induce vomiting. So in accordance with whose opinion is this Baraisa? It is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yosei. As if it were in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis, is there not also soaking and laundering that should have been excluded from the Baraisa? As in the rabbi's opinion, use of the sabbatical year produce for those purposes is forbidden. Rabbi Yosei would permit it under his theory that the Torah is really talking about eating and not these other uses. Or at least not some of those other uses. All right, we come back to our discussion of giving wool to a dyer and he dyes it the wrong color, right? Continue our discussion of Mishnah number 4 here in chapter 9. So the Mishnah on page 100b taught that if the owner gave wool to a dyer to dye it red, but the dyer instead dyed it black, so in that case, Rabbi Meir says the dyer gives the owner of the wool the value of his wool, and meaning that the dyer is going to keep the wool, right? So I went to the dyer, I said, here's my wool, dye it black. I show up the next day to get my wool back, he dyed it red. I'm like, I'm unhappy. Now, do I get my wool back that has been dyed and a discount because it's dyed the wrong color? According to Rabbi Meir, no. He just pays me for the wool that I brought him, so I can now go out and buy wool, and I'll be right where I was before I started with this guy. And he keeps the wool that's dyed the wrong color, and he only has to pay the value of the wool, and then the work that and the materials and the resources that he put into dyeing it, he acquires that. So now he has red dyed wool that he can go and sell to somebody who wants red dyed wool, whereas I wanted black. Right? So the dyer gives the owner of the wool the value of his wool. That's Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda says, if the value of the enhancement exceeds the dyer's expenses, the owner of the wool gives the dyer the expenses. So I took my wool to him. He dyed it the wrong color. I'm going to get a discount, and I'm going to get my wool back with its coloring. It's the wrong color, so I don't have to pay as much. I'm either going to have to, I'm paying the lesser of the increase in value in this color, or the amount of money he spent to dye it that color. I pay the lesser amount of that, but I get my colored wool back. Now, the Gemara provides a mnemonic device, which is the acrostic Saban, for the names of the sages involved in the following incident. Each letter in the acrostic represents the middle letter of one of the names. Samech for Rav Yosef, and Beis for Rabbi Abba, and Nun for Rav Huna. So, the Gemara relates. Rav Yosef was sitting behind Rabbi Abba, and they were both sitting before Rav Huna. And Rav Huna was sitting and saying, the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Korcha, and the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. So Rav Yosef turned his face in disdain of Rav Huna's statement, and he said, granted, stating that the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Korcha, this is necessary, as it would enter your mind to say that there is a principle that when there is a dispute between an individual and the many, the law is in accordance with the opinion of the many. Rav Huna therefore teaches us that in this case, the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Korcha, despite the fact that he is an individual. Now the Gemara interrupts Rav Yosef's remark and asks, what is the ruling of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Korcha to which Rav Huna was referring? It is, as it is taught in a Baraisa, that Rabbi Yehoshua ben Korcha says that with regard to a loan with a promissory note, one may not collect the loan from Gentiles near the time of their holidays, but with regard to a loan by oral agreement, one may collect from Gentiles even near the time of their holidays, because the creditor is considered as one who salvages money from their possession. Why wouldn't you take money that was from them at the time of their holidays? Because it might have been used in avodah zarah, right, in idolatrous practices. But with regard to the statement that the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, why do I need to say that? This is an example of the Mishna recording a dispute and afterward recording only one side of that dispute as an unattributed opinion. And the principle is that when the Mishna records a dispute and afterwards records only one side of that dispute as an unattributed opinion, then the law is in accordance with the unattributed opinion. Now, the Gemara identifies the dispute and the unattributed Mishnah in question. The dispute is found in tractate Bava Kamma. If one gave wool to the dyer to dye it red for him and instead he dyed it black, or to dye it black and he dyed it red, Rabbi Meir says the dyer gives the owner of the wool the value of his wool. Rabbi Yehuda says if the value of the enhancement exceeds the expenses, the owner of the wool gives the expenses to the dyer. And if the expenses exceed the enhancement, he gives him the value of the enhancement. And the unattributed Mishnah appears in tractate Bava Metzia. As we learned in a Mishnah there on page 76a, that's our next tractate, whoever changes from the terms of an agreement is at a disadvantage, and whoever reneges from an agreement is at a disadvantage. This unattributed Mishnah accords with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, who holds that a craftsman who deviates from his assignment receives either the expenses or the enhancement, whichever is of lesser value. So the Gemara asks, and being that this is a dispute and afterwards an unattributed opinion, why did Rav Huna find it necessary to state that the law follows the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda? It is necessary. It is necessary. As if it would enter your mind to say that the Mishnah is not sequential. And in fact, this is a case of an unattributed ruling followed by a dispute. It's not that first we had the dispute between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda, and later there was an unattributed Mishnah that seemingly resolved that dispute or reflects how the sages resolved the dispute at a later time, but rather, perhaps, there was an unattributed Mishnah, and then later than that, Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda said, you know what, that unattributed Mishnah didn't get it right, and then they started arguing it out. So in that situation, we don't know where the law ends up. And that's why Rav Huna felt the need to say this. And why does Rav Yosef disagree? He disagrees because if that is so, then with regard to every case where a dispute is recorded, and afterward an unattributed opinion is recorded, well, let us say the Mishnah is not sequential, and this is a case of an unattributed ruling followed by a dispute. Even if that's possible, we're not going to say that because that could undermine many established halachas. And Rav Huna would respond, the situation where we do not say that the Mishnah is not sequential, i.e., where we might say that the Mishnah is sequential, is only when both Mishnayos appear in one tractate. But when they appear in two different tractates, we say that the Mishnah is not sequential. Since these Mishnayos are found in two different tractates, Bava Kamma and Bava Metzia, the assumption is that this Mishnah is not sequential. And Rav Yosef would respond, all of this Seder, right, all of this order of tractates, known as Nizikin, damages, which we started when we entered Bava Kamma, and includes Bava Kamma, Bava Metzia, and Bava Basra, is considered, halakhically speaking, one tractate. And if you wish, say that even if Bava Kamma and Bava Metzia are to be considered two separate tractates, Rav Yosef would still hold that Rav Huna's statement was unnecessary because it is taught as one of a pair of established halachas. So whoever changes from the terms of an agreement is at a disadvantage, and whoever reneges on an agreement is at a disadvantage. And since this ruling was taught with another established halacha, it is apparent that this is also an established halacha. Let's return to our dispute. There was another dispute related to it concerning one who deviates from the terms of the agreement, right? The dyer was told to make it red and he made it black. So related law. The sages taught in the Tosefta Bava Metzia, one who gives money to his agent, now we're on 102b, to purchase wheat for him, which he plans to sell at a profit, and instead the agent purchased barley with the money. Or if he gave the agent money to purchase barley, and instead the agent purchased wheat. Two baraisas issue discordant rulings with regard to the law in such a situation. It is taught in one baraisa that if there was a loss, the loss is for the agent. And if there was a profit, the profit is for the agent as well, as he is considered to have abrogated his status as an agent by deviating from his principal's instructions. And it is taught in a different baraisa, tractate Bava Metzia, that if there was an agreement that both parties would split the profits from the transaction, if there was a loss, the loss is for the agent. And if there was a profit, the profit is split down the middle between the agent and the investor. Now, to reconcile these baraisas, Rabbi Yochanan said, this is not difficult, la kasha. This first baraisa is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Meir, right, who said that the owner just has to pay for the wool. That the craftsman just has to pay for the wool. And the second baraisa is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, who says that the one who owned the wool gets his wool back minus the discount because it was dyed the wrong color. So Rabbi Yochanan explains his rationale. This first baraisa is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Meir, who says that a change by an agent that deviates from the terms of his assignment means that the agent acquires the item in question for himself, as in the case of one who was paid to dye wool red, but he dyed it black. So in this case as well, when the agent purchases wheat instead of barley or vice versa, he acquires the grain for himself. And this second baraisa is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, who says that a change by an agent which deviates from the terms of his assignment does not mean that the agent acquires the item in question for himself. It is acquired by the one who appointed the agent, and they split the profits as agreed. But the agent is held responsible for any loss incurred because he deviated from his instructions. Now, Rabbi Elazar objects to Rabbi Yochanan's explanation of the dispute between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda. Says Rabbi Lazar, from where do you say that the dispute between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda extends to the case of these barises? Perhaps Rabbi Meir says that a change by an agent from the terms of his assignment results in the acquisition of the item by the agent only with regard to an item that is fit for use by the one who appointed the agent himself, such as wool dyed the wrong color, which is now unusable for its intended purpose. But Rabbi Meir does not say his ruling with regard to an item purchased for subsequent sale as merchandise, since it is intended to be sold for a profit in any event, and the transaction would take effect as agreed upon initially, with the agent held responsible for any loss incurred, right? If it's going to be purchased for the purpose of reselling it, okay, the guy didn't follow his instructions, but it can still be resold. So he's going to have to absorb the risk of loss. But if they make a profit anyway, then they split the profit because the investor gave the money to the agent to go buy stuff. And they said they were going to split profit, so they still do. Rather, Rabbi Lazar said, both this baraisa and that baraisa are written in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Meir. And it is not difficult. Here in the first baraisa, wait a minute. Yeah, okay. Rather, Rabbi Lazar said, both this baraisa and that baraisa are written in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Meir, and it is not difficult. Here in the first baraisa, it is discussing grain purchased for eating. And since the one who appointed the agent desired wheat, he does not acquire the barley. But there in the second baraisa, it is discussing grain purchased for subsequent sale as merchandise, and the transaction takes effect as agreed upon initially, with the agent held responsible for any loss incurred, but they still are co-owners of what the agent purchased. Now, the Gemara notes that they laughed at it in the West, meaning in Eretz Yisrael, at the explanation of Rabbi Yochanan, who said that according to the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, a deviation by an agent from the terms of his assignment does not result in the acquisition of the item for the agent himself. And who informed the owner of the wheat, i.e. the seller, that he should transfer the wheat to the owner of the money? If the seller was unaware that the agent was acting on someone else's behalf, how would the one who appointed the agent acquire the wheat? Rav Shmuel bar Sasrati objects to this rationale, meaning the agent acquired the wheat because he's the one who handed money to the seller, and then the seller gave him the wheat, and the agent acquired. Now, the agent was making a kinyan, right, a formal act of acquisition on behalf of himself and his principal. But what they're saying here is, okay, but from the seller's point of view, the one who acquired was this guy standing in front of him. So this would seem to be an argument for, now that the agent has deviated from the instructions of his principal, and he gave money to a seller, and the seller gave him wheat, so of course he personally acquired it. So Rav Shmuel bar Sasrati objects to this rationale. If so, then even in a case where the agent was sent to purchase wheat, and he purchased wheat, the one who appointed the agent should not acquire the wheat with him, since the seller was unaware that the agent was acting on someone else's behalf. So Rabbi Abahu said the case of an agent who was assigned to purchase wheat, and he purchased wheat, is different, as the agent is performing his assignment, and as such, he is like the customer, i.e. the one who appointed him, and it is as though the latter has purchased the grain himself. He is fulfilling his agency on behalf of the actual buyer, right? So it doesn't matter what the seller thinks. He's performed his agency. Of course, the investor is the one who acquires. Now, Rabbi Abahu further explains, and no, you should know that the agent is viewed as an extension of the one who appointed him, as we learned in the Mishna, tractate Arachin, concerning both one who consecrates his property and one who valuates himself by donating his fixed value to the temple, that the temple treasury does not have any rights with regard to the donor's wife's clothing, and not with regard to his children's clothing, and not with regard to new clothes colored with dye that the donor dyed for his wife or children, and not with regard to new sandals that the donor purchased for his wife or children. In other words, one who pledges to give money to the temple. So until he fulfills his pledge, the temple treasury was understood to have a lien on his property. On his property, yes, but not on items that he gifted even to his immediate family, and certainly not to other people, third parties, But even if it's to his own family, once he gives it to members of his family, the temple treasury can't look to those items for this, to seize in order to fulfill this man's pledge. Presumably, the treasurer has no right to these items. Why? Because they are for the personal use of the donor's wife and children, and so they are considered as if owned by them. Now, Rabbi Bahu continues, and why is it so? Why is it that the wife is considered the owner of the dyed clothing for which the husband paid? Here also, let us say, who informed the dyer that he should transfer his dye to the wife? Rather, is it not because we say that the husband is performing his assignment as his wife's agent? And as such, he is like an extension of his wife's hand. Here also, in the case of one who purchases grain for another, the agent is performing his assignment, and he is like an extension of the buyer's hand. Now, the Gemara rejects this explanation. Rabbi Abba said, no, the reason for the ruling of the Mishnah is that the intention of anyone who consecrates his property is not upon the clothing of his wife and his children. He didn't intend to consecrate those items. That's why the temple can't seize them. Rabbi Zera objects to Rabbi Abba's explanation. And is it the intention of a person who consecrates his property to do so upon his tefillin? Presumably not. And we learned in a Mishnah that with regard to one who consecrates all of his property, his tefillin are evaluated for him, and they have become consecrated. He no longer owns them. Apparently, lack of intent to consecrate a particular item does not prevent its consecration if a person consecrates all his property. Abaye said to Rabbi Zera, yes, the intention of a person who consecrates his property is upon his tefillin, because one who consecrates his property thinks to himself, I am performing a mitzvah, and he therefore intends to include his tefillin. But the intention of a person is not upon the clothing of his wife and his children due to the enmity that would be engendered if he consecrated their clothing. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. So Rabbi Oshaya also objects to Rabbi Abba's explanation, but is it not so that the matter of those who are obligated in valuations was taught here in the Mishnah? And we learned in a Mishnah in Tractate Arachin, concerning those who are obligated in valuations, the temple treasury seizes collateral from them to force them to fulfill their vow. And is the intention of a person upon himself to allow the treasurer to seize collateral from him? Presumably not. And nevertheless, the collateral is seized from him, proving that one's intention does not prevent items within his property to be consecrated. So accordingly, even if it is assumed that he does not intend to consecrate the clothing of his wife or children, that clothing could nevertheless be consecrated. Why then is the clothing of his wife or children not consecrated? So rather, Rabbi Abba also holds that the reason the clothing is not consecrated is not due to his intent. And he said a different explanation. Anyone who consecrates his property becomes as one who transferred his wife's and his children's clothing to them at the outset. Therefore, the clothing did not belong to him at the time that he consecrated his property. That was a digression on the question that we've been discussing. We'll continue with tomorrow, right, about who acquires the raw materials that were turned into the wrong final product by a craftsman. Okay, Sharon, there is an amazing story about a rabbi in Bergen-Belsen who created a blessing on not being able to eat matzah in order to be able to fulfill the mitzvah as a result. I teach it every year to my students in order to live by the mitzvahs and not die by them, right? So Sharon's making a very important point. If trying so hard to fulfill a mitzvah is going to endanger your life, you're not obligated in that mitzvah. You're exempt from performing that mitzvah. Because as Sharon says, to live by these commandments, not to die by them, right? The commandments are given to us for our benefit. It's not some kind of onerous burden. There's so much value, personal value, not only in the next world, but even in this world, right? That's why we say that the reward of a mitzvah is the next mitzvah. They're given for our benefit. One of the beautiful things about doing any mitzvah is at the time you're performing the mitzvah, you don't have to worry that there's no FOMO. When you're performing a mitzvah, you're doing the most important thing in the world. You don't need to be afraid that there's something else you should be doing, work that you're not accomplishing, whatever. When you're doing a mitzvah, you can be at peace because you know you're doing what you're intended to do. But if performing a mitzvah endangers your life, well, then you're not intended to do that. Mitzvah is the lesson Sharon is teaching. Lucy, I think Akiva's surrendering such a painful, precious, and costly mitzvah to Aryeh is an act of great love, surely pleasing to Hashem, who in my view might have been behind Aryeh's request. I see it like you do. Yes, Lucy. Karen, is it possible that the wine used for laundry is actually vinegar? Maybe that's what they're talking about. It's so hard to imagine wine that could be used for laundering. Maybe it was some kind of a white wine that wouldn't actually stain the clothing pink. Maybe it was a vinegar that could be used to remove certain stains. I bet you're right. And Miriam Tenorio, you can actually use ash for laundering. Absolutely. And that was one of the substances that was used. There's a little bit of a discussion here about stuff that was used for laundering. In Talmudic times, clothes were laundered with a variety of substances, soda and potash, which are found in various plants and rocks, as well as the ash of burnt plants were used for this purpose. So thank you very much for that. That's what I've got for us today, and with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow night, Tuesday at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific, for a single daf, page 103. Look forward to learning with that with you tomorrow. All the best.